trade agreements don't help, so.
I don't.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here. This is the Trade Policy Commission. I am State Senator Troy Jackson, and I'm the Senate Chair of the Commission.
Senator Jackson, Representative Treat, members of the Commission, it really is a pleasure to be here. I'm John Piotti. I'm the Executive Director of Maine Farmland Trust, a statewide membership organization, 4,100 members that works to protect farmland and support farmers and advance the future of farming in Maine. As many of you know, I've also served in the legislature and had the honor of serving in the same position that Senator Jackson did till not too long ago. I was chair of the Agriculture Committee. And I've worked with farmers and on farming issues now professionally for 20 years in a number of capacities, at CI for many years, where Mr. Cole now works, and at my current job. And I've had the opportunity to work in Sweden and Brussels and Italy on some farm issues that gives me a bit of an international perspective. I will focus on talking a little bit about the dairy industry and the potential impacts of this on dairy. Our pricing system, which is basically set by the federal government, has been pretty much cushioned from impacts of international activities. And the primary reason it's been cushioned is that the pricing system, the milk pricing system, has less dependence on what you would call true supply and demand than you might want. And it's principally federal policy. And that's good and bad. It's been bad for our dairy farmers because it's meant the price they get paid for their milk is often below the cost of production. And as many of us know, our dairy industry has been struggling. The good side of that is it means craziness that might happen worldwide has not had too much an effect on the dairy industry. But the world has changed in the not too distant past, and a lot of people don't realize this. For one thing, U.S. dairy products are increasingly being exported. They really weren't being exported to a great extent until not too many years ago. Today, U.S. dairy products, 15% of dairy products are exported. The experts in this matter, and Bob Wellington, some of you might know, who's the economist for Agrimart in Cabot Cheese, one of the experts in this area, he always uses the figure that a 2% change in supply of U.S. milk products will affect the federal price of milk by about 20%. And so if right now we're exporting about 15% of our dairy products, if that dropped 2%, if that dropped from 15 to 13%, it would probably have roughly a 20% negative effect on the price paid to farmers in this country, which would be devastating. These farms are on the edge now. And any kind of international policy that potentially puts in place competition that will reduce our export market threatens to do that. The price that farmers are paid for their milk is part of the formula includes the price of cheese. It's actually written into the law as the higher of the price of cheese or non-fat powder. And for almost all the time I've ever been looking at this stuff, the price of cheese is always up here and the price of non-fat dairy powder is down there. And so the higher of those has been cheese. And that's been the figure that's been factored in. For better or worse, there's been a huge spike in the last year for non-fat powder and coming from international markets. And as a result of that, that is now the higher of the two. And even though you think that non-fat milk, dry milk, can't have a lot of value, you'd be amazed at what the commodity price of cheese is too. We're not talking about expensive stuff here. But it is fascinating that those two have reversed. But what it means is the price paid to a dairy farmer in Maine today is determined by the world market price for powder. And if something like this trade agreement goes into effect, that is a highly vulnerable number. So long term, this could have terrible impacts on exports that would really sort of undermine our dairy industry. But short term, just the effect that it would probably have on dry powder prices will take away the only thing that is keeping the dairy industry alive right now. Their prices are horrible, but they would be that much more horrible if it wasn't for this. Now, not all of you know this, but the state of Maine has done an awful lot to support the dairy industry since 2004, when we enacted some very creative things at the legislative level. But they have been just enough that keep the industry alive. And it wouldn't take much to have that industry fall apart. This could do it. And I will just remind you of what the dairy industry means to this state. It's about 20% of our agricultural production, milk sales of about $100 million a year, but economic impact of about $525 million a year. It employs about 4,000 people. It is the only economic activity in large parts of rural Maine, and the dairy farms pay about $25 million a year in taxes to this state. That would be gone. People might say, well, we're never going to import milk from New Zealand. And that may or may not be true. But it doesn't matter, because just flooding the market with powder will destroy the dairy industry here. The dairy products that are exported are cheese to some extent, and a lot of it is whey, which is increasingly used in a dry form in a variety of manufactured processes, and then there's dry milk as well.
And also,
Very little fluid milk, maybe even none, I'm not sure, but very little, if any, fluid milk is exported. The price of milk in the United States is set by the federal government. It has very little to do with supply and demand. It's set by an incredibly cumbersome, complicated formula that has evolved over 125 years. And for better or worse, it's what it is. And in the near future, it's not going to change. And so the normal economics of pricing are non-existent. And that's part of the reason why I think a lot of people are never necessarily worried about what happens internationally, not thinking it will have an effect on milk. My point is, because American dairy products have started to be exported, it will have more of an effect than it used to. And then my second point is that formula today is bolstered and only as high as it is because of the international price of dried milk. It seems weird. The fact what Maine farmers are getting paid for fluid milk is determined by the world price of powdered milk. But that's the reality of an incredibly complicated formula the United States uses to set the price of milk for farmers.
so
The pricing formula is what the farmers get paid. It's not a price of the product. And that's a little confusing, because usually we think of price as what a consumer pays. When I talk about the price of milk, I'm talking about what a farmer gets for 100 weight of milk. Right now, about $21 a gallon to produce 100 pounds of milk. That's what the federal government sets. The federal government does not set the price of milk that is paid by the consumer. It's controlled by the federal government. It's controlled differently in different regions. So there's not a federal price. We're in this area, we're part of the one federal order system. The way it works is the price that's paid to the farmer, what the producer gets paid is set by that system, the federal order system. The price that's then paid to the processor, say an Oakhurst, a processor of fluid milk, an Oakhurst or a Hood, that's determined in a similar way to how the rates for CMP are determined. It's sort of like a public utility process where information from the company is provided. In this case, it's provided to the Maine Milk Commission. and they make a determination on what that processor should be paid. And it's determined, like with a public utility, cost of production plus a little. So in theory, they make a little profit. The farmer, the price has nothing to do with the farmer's cost of production. That's just what comes out of the formula, and it's frequently below the cost of production. And then the next stage, the processor, that's regulated in the manner I just described. And then if you're talking about fluid milk, the next stage would be the Oakhurst milk then goes to Hannaford, and they sell it. And the only controls on Hannaford is there's a state minimum, but they can charge whatever they want. That's the only place where supply and demand really come into play on what the public is willing to pay for a gallon of milk. But the Maine Milk Commission plays an incredibly important role here because we have this very complicated federal system. Their intervention helps a lot, and they actually have flexibility to provide some premiums. And so Maine farmers get paid more than farmers in some other areas, in part because of the commission and then in part because of this legislation which we talked about, which is administered by the commission. So the Maine Milk Commission has played a critically important role in keeping our dairy industry alive.
Percentage of Maine dairy products that are exported?
Probably not. Maine basically produces about the same amount of milk as, or I should say, we consume dairy products, which is roughly equivalent to the amount of milk we produce. That doesn't mean we're not importing products. Where obviously you buy cheese that's made in France, you buy ice cream or cheese that might be made in Massachusetts or Wisconsin. But basically there's a rough balance. We're producing about the same amount as we are using. Farm products, especially products or products from smaller farms, you don't necessarily have to go that far afield to find the markets. And in fact, the best markets are often local markets because they're people who know where the food comes from and get the connection. Realize that if I'm buying from my farmer down the street and I run the hardware store, that's good for me too because he comes into my store and buys. So I'm a believer that the best markets are close to home, the multipliers are higher and the like. And for food products in particular, if you're looking for food products that are going to command a premium price, they are often in that category. Now Maine has, I don't want to bog you guys down too much. I mean, the story of agriculture in Maine, if you want to take a snapshot at where we are right now, and I'm stealing this from Stu Smith, the name some of you might remember. He was the Commissioner of Agriculture about 25 years ago in Maine. He describes the status of agriculture in Maine right now as a bifurcation, sort of two paths. And you have farms that what a lot of people would consider this to be what they quintessentially think of as farms in Maine. They look like farms, they have heavy equipment, they've got silos, It'd be the bigger potato farms in the state, most of our dairy farms, blueberries, some of our orchards. They're not big by national standards, but they usually are bigger farms by Maine standards. And these are farms that principally sell their products as commodities. So they're either selling to a processor or they're selling to a big distributor. That's one track. The other track has gone by different names over the 20 years that I've been involved in this, but the term that's usually applied now is local agriculture. And what distinguishes the two tracks, over here they may be small farms, they may be big farms. Granted, most of the smaller farms are in this area. What really distinguishes this track is how they market. They market direct or close to direct. So they're selling through a farmer's market or a CSA or a farm stand or a couple of relationships with a few stores or whatever. And that's really the story of agriculture in Maine right now. And the bulk of production is here in commodity, but almost all of the growth has been in local. And this is where the opportunities are. And it's not that this is old and tired and bad. The problem is over here, the middlemen get on the money. So, Stu Smith, when he went from being Commissioner of Agriculture, he went to found the Sustainable Ag Program at the University of Maine, and he developed this wonderful chart that shows basically the cost of food over the last 70 years in the United States, and what the farmer has basically received over time. And there's this gaping alligator mouth. And that's the money that flows to the middlemen. And this is true whether you talk about forest products or whether you talk about fisheries. I mean, it's true in everything. But as a result, in agriculture, and this goes back to your question, Representative Treat, about encouraging exports. I'm all in favor of encouraging exports. I'm all in favor of agriculture at multiple scales, Maine scale anyway. And we really do have only family farms in this state. But the truth is, farms that are operating at those commodity scales, even if they're exporting a lot more, it doesn't necessarily mean that much benefit to the farmer. The benefit ends up flowing to somebody else. But if you can establish local markets, you can keep that home. So I'm not against export in concept, but I don't think it's the best way on which to build the farm economy here in Maine. The price of organic milk is not set by the federal order system, so it's outside that, and it's usually done with contracts between the processors and the farmers. So that could be small scale, something like Moo Milk, larger scale, Horizon or Stonyfield or something like that. And so they're outside the federal order system, which sounds good, but it's not as good as you think. And here's why. What supply and demand comes in on the consumer side. And what some consumers will want to buy organic milk no matter what, for whatever reason. But if the price of conventional milk, as that changes, the demand for organic milk changes a lot. People will pay it when the difference in premium is maybe 75 cents a gallon. They won't go for organic when the difference is $1.50 a gallon. So even though the federal order system legally does not control the price, for all intents and purposes, it still has a huge bearing on the price. From the farmer's perspective, they do get paid more, but their costs are more. So a lot of farmers in Maine, we now have probably the highest percentage of organic dairy farmers in the country. It's probably about 18%. A lot of farmers got into it because the numbers looked really good 10, 12 years ago, and they were better for a while. And right now, it's not a noticeable difference at all. The demand for dry milk has gone up as worldwide development. I mean, a lot of it is demand from China and other developing nations that have traditionally not used a lot of dairy products. And they're using it now, plus they're using it as inputs to a lot of processed products.